Hi everyone, Josh here again down at Get Real Audio, and this is part 3 of my basic home recording tutorial series, and I'm going to call this one Microphone. Okay, so we're going to dive right in and plug microphones in, get some levels, and see what kind of sound we can make. So for the most of this I'll be using my trusty SM57. This is a Shure dynamic microphone, pretty inexpensive and very simple in design. I'm going to get my XLR cable, so that's a 3-pin connection on either end, microphone in one end, and I'm going to plug it into my audio interface on the other end. So I'm using this Audient, this is the ID44 interface today. I would use the one I showed you the other day, the ID14, which has 2 inputs, but I want to try something out later on where I can demonstrate multiple microphones. I'm going to plug in 3, so I use this one because it has 4 inputs. So I'm going to plug my SM57 in to input number 1. So now I'm confronted with 3 switches here. This will be different on every audio interface, but this is representative of all the different options you might have. On each channel I have a switch labelled plus 48V. That's otherwise known as phantom power. You might have a switch on each channel. You might have a global switch for the whole interface. I know the smaller Focusrite devices have one button. I think it says phantom power. So it'll either say 48 plus 48V or phantom power. What that is a power source supplied by the audio interface that some kinds of microphone require. So if you have a condenser microphone, either a small diaphragm or a large diaphragm condenser microphone, it will require phantom power. Whereas this dynamic microphone doesn't require phantom power. It won't damage it to have it on, but it's best to switch it off if you don't need it. The other switches I have on the channels of this audio interface, which are less common on the smaller ones, are minus 10 dB, which is often otherwise labelled as pad. That turns the signal down if it's too loud for the recording software. And the last switch is a diagonal line followed by a horizontal line, and that's the symbol for a low cut, which takes away the rumbly frequencies. You won't want to use this switch when recording instruments that contain low frequencies, so that certainly includes bass instruments and bass drums, that kind of thing, and maybe even acoustic guitars. There's some quite low things you want to capture, so I'd turn that on if you're recording anything higher, so things like a vocal or a mandolin or smaller acoustic instruments, violins, just to get rid of rumbles and pops, that kind of thing. So I'll leave all of those switches off for now. So I'm going to pop my microphone into the plastic clip on my microphone stand. Remember I mentioned in the first episode that the clips are individual to different microphones, so you'll need to use the clip that came with this microphone. I'm going to point this roughly in the direction of my guitar. It's a good idea to hang the cable over the stand so that it's not trailing across the space. You may well find that you'll knock the cable and then move the position, which means that subsequent takes would sound different. So I'm going to grab my freshly tuned guitar and talk to you about microphone position. So on an acoustic guitar, the best place to point a microphone is in this box between where the neck joins the body and where the sound hole starts. So I usually aim somewhere in that rectangle there, and I'd aim directly at the guitar at that point. If you point the microphone too close to the sound hole, you might find that it sounds too boomy and heavy sounding. It's not particularly pleasant. And if you point the microphone too far up the fingerboard, it can get too thin sounding, and you might hear too much of those noises, which can also be a bit distracting. So that's a good sweet spot if you're using one microphone to point it at that box area there. The next step is to set an input level into our recording software. And you do that using the gain control on the front panel of your audio interface. The software I'm using is Apple's Logic, but all the different DAW software types work the same way for this function. So GarageBand, Cakewalk, Ableton, Pro Tools, FL Studio, anything that you're using. You need to press the red R button on the channel that you intend to record to. So it requires you to make an audio channel to start with. It's usually a menu called track, and it'll be a mono audio track that you require. Mono means that it just has a single input into that channel. One microphone, one input, one single input mono channel. If you try and record this onto a stereo channel, you'll find that it only records on the left side. I've pressed the red R, and I'm going to rotate the gain control until I start to see some level There we go, on the green meter. So next I'll play the guitar into the microphone, watch the meter, and critically I don't want to hit the top of the meter, which is 0. If I did, I should also see a red light pop on as a warning that I'm too loud and it could distort. Ideally, the average volume will be passing the -20 point, which on this meter is about where my cursor is now. I hope you can see that. I'll leave the cursor just there and I'm going to play the guitar and see what happens. So I'm going to play the loudest passage from my piece. So that volume could do with going up slightly. So now the loudest sound I'm going to make in this piece isn't going to bother the 0 point, the top of the meter. So that's good. Now you'll find if you're using a dynamic microphone that it might be hard to get the meter to be particularly loud. That's because these microphones are less responsive than the condenser microphone equivalents. There is a device you can use to make dynamic microphones louder. So if you like the sound of dynamic microphones and that's what you own, there's a device which is essentially a preamp that goes before your audio interface that will increase the volume of the dynamic microphone quite significantly. The one I have is made by Cloud Lifter, and there's another cheaper device available by Triton Audio called the Fethead. So with my level set, my microphone in the right position, I'm ready to start recording. So what I've done now is I've got 3 different kinds of microphones and I've clustered them all as close together as I can make them so we can compare the differences between the 3 kinds of microphones. I've already set the levels on these, and the first thing I've noticed is that the dynamic microphone, the SM57 in this case, has to be turned up almost all the way to achieve a usable volume. The small diaphragm condenser, which is in my channel 2, has to be turned up 2/3 of the available gain I have on this particular interface. And the large diaphragm microphone, this big Sontronics STC2, is only turned up halfway. So we can tell from that the Sontronics STC2 is the most sensitive of the 3 microphones here. And these all record at pretty much the same volume with those settings. So with my microphones pointing at the box area of my guitar, I'm going to play the accompaniment part of my piece of music 3 times with the set of microphones at 3 different distances. So we can compare the differences between the different microphones and the different distances. And when I play them back, I'll play them so you can hear them at the same volume, regardless of them getting quieter as they're further away, so that we can make a good judgment about whether we like how they sound in different positions. On the first part I record, I'll need to count it in so that the subsequent parts I record will know when to start playing. When I count, I'm going to not count the last number, so there's a bit of time for me to edit out the counting without it being too abrupt at the beginning of the piece. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2. So what you heard there was when the microphones are closer to the instrument, you'll notice that they sound richer or maybe to the point of being boomy. That's a thing called proximity effect, and that describes when a microphone is very close in proximity to something that there's an increase in low frequencies. So sometimes that can be too much for a guitar, and so a bit more distance is a good idea. So for my tastes, certainly with the condenser microphones, that's the Sontronics on the Octava, I quite like the second position, which was at 16 inches. And that's usually my starting point for recording an acoustic instrument. Further away, at 30 inches, you'll be slightly more aware of the sound of the room. And different rooms will become more apparent at different distances, depending on how reverberant they are. So this room's fairly well controlled, and I can record at fairly distant positions if I want to. But if your room is quite lively, you'll find you want to come a little bit closer. So with that in mind, I thought of all the microphones in the very, very close position, the one that shone was the SM57. It didn't seem to have quite as much of that boomy sound as the other microphones. In the middle position, then either of the two condenser microphones seem to sound quite nice. So what I'm pointing out here is if you have a dynamic microphone, you can afford to be quite close. If you have a condenser microphone, you need to get further away to get rid of the bloom, but not so far away that all you can hear is the sound of your room. You'll need to do a bit of trial and error to get that right. Often in more professional recording situations, we may well use a number of microphones per instrument. Sometimes that's to make it sound wider, or sometimes it's to use the character of different microphones simultaneously. There might be a bright mic and a warm mic that you like the sound of both of them together. It's quite complicated to set those kinds of things up. But one question I get when I suggest to people they use one microphone on each instrument is, what if I want to make my instrument sound a bit wider? And there's an easy solution to this, and it's a bit of a trick. And that is simply to perform the part again, a second time, and use the pan controls in your DAW software to make them sound wide. And it's a very common trick in slightly more poppy material, and we're starting to hear it more and more in more traditional styles. In order to be able to overlay a second part, I'm going to need to be able to hear the first part that I played. So I've plugged my headphones in, and now we need to work out how we're going to hear the two things. So it might not be necessary to hear the part I'm going to play now. I could just pull my headphones so that it doesn't cover both ears. And I can still clearly hear the guitar that I'm playing, whilst also hear the guitar from the computer through the second earphone. But there will be a control on the front panel of your audio interface or in software that comes bundled with it, which will allow you to hear the microphone directly into the headphones. Now, the reason why we don't want to hear the microphone via the DAW software and then into the headphones is because that will induce a slight delay, which can be quite off-putting when you're playing, can affect the rhythm. It's just not very nice. So the trick is to mute the track that you're performing to while you're wearing the headphones, and either use the direct monitoring switch, which I don't have on this box here, but you may well have if you have a Focusrite 2i2 or an M box, or whichever device it is you have that's smaller. They usually have a direct input monitoring button or a switch or a volume control, like a mix control, whereas I'll have to use the ID software that comes with this Audient ID interface. The larger Focusrites have a thing called, I think it's Focusrite Mix Control or something like that. They all have different ones. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2. So now I can make another track and start adding extra parts. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2. With any other instrument, it's all about thinking about where the sound comes from, what's going to be too loud for the microphone, too shrill, too boomy. With mandolins, they're not particularly rich sounding on their own, and it's nice to enhance that somehow. So by pointing roughly at the F-holes, again taking into consideration the distance that we talked about earlier on. So I'm going to be, this is about 8 to 10 inches, roughly pointing at the lower area of the soundboard where the F-hole is. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2. And the same follows for all other acoustic instruments. So with the banjo, being too close and too far into the centre of the head can be a little bit too much for the microphone. So moving slightly off the centre, slightly further away can work quite well. Depends how loud the banjo is. With dobros, There are two areas in a dobro that make sound. There's the sound hole, which is very warm, and there's the cone, which is very bright. So I tend to put a microphone somewhere between the two of them, again, observing the distance rules that we talked about earlier on. With a double bass, this is quite a complicated one. There's quite a subby, low sound further down the body, and then up where the finger plucks, there's quite a nice thump sound, like a ticky sound, which can be nice to capture. So I tend to put the microphone further towards the fingers rather than the sub sound, because the sub can get overwhelming. Again, that's with experimentation. With double bass, it's quite nice to be quite powerful sounding, so you might want to take advantage of that proximity effect of it being very kind of punchy. Again, experimentation depends on your room. So with instruments that move air, you need to be very careful about the air moving the microphone too ferociously. So I'm talking about flutes and whistles, and also things like brass instruments, trumpets and trombones, making sure that the microphone isn't right in the firing line of blowing sounds. With instrument amplifiers, so maybe for an electric guitar, sometimes even a bass guitar, you'd use a microphone on the amplifier. Same microphones would work quite well. The SM57 is really good at amplifiers because it can put up with quite high volumes. Generally, if you have a speaker cone, let's imagine this is one, the center is the bright point, and towards the edge is the warm point. So people often put microphones halfway between the center and the edge. That's called the sweet spot. You can afford to be fairly close when miking a speaker. Further away, and you might get a slightly more old-fashioned sound, which can be really nice, a sort of T-Bone Burnett kind of atmosphere. If you're miking a drum, so the kind of drum that you'd hit with a skin rather than with a foot pedal, then you want the microphone to be out of the way of the sticks, obviously. So if you point the microphone in from the edge of the drum towards the point where the stick hits the skin, that's how you'll get most impact out of the drum, and it should sound really punchy and powerful. And lastly, with a voice, all the same rules apply of distance and space against proximity effect, except of course, similarly to a flute or a whistle or a trumpet, you're moving air, so you want to be quite careful. And you could use something like a pop shield to reduce the effect of very, very violent moving air. And by that I mean things like plosives, we call them, very loud P sounds. Or B's, or other times when you might move quite a lot of air in a short space of time. So these just attach to the microphone stand quite simply with a bracket. Ultimately, the thing should be roughly halfway between the voice and the microphone. So I tend to start recording vocals at around about 10 inches, which means that the pop shield is 5 inches from either surface. So something I promised to talk about in this episode, which I haven't mentioned yet, is recording with pickups. So the general rule is that the sound of a microphone on an instrument will always be more realistic than the sound of a pickup. And I tend to stick to that. I very, very rarely use the sound of a pickup in a recording. However, I will sometimes capture it just as a backup, or if there's lots of other sound going on in the room in a situation where I'm recording 4 or 5 instrumentalists simultaneously. But even then, I'll try and avoid using it because it sounds so unrealistic compared to a microphone. And I'm talking about the best pickups in the world here. They simply can't sound realistic because they're too close to the instrument. They won't get all of the different parts of the sound. Also, there are complications with regard to recording the pickup and a microphone at the same time. The sound takes time to travel to the microphone, whereas it doesn't to the pickup because it's attached to the instrument. And you'd have to manually time align that afterwards, either using clever plugins or your eyes. So I tend to avoid it if I can. So there are times when recording directly with a pickup is the best thing to do. I almost always record bass guitars directly from their pickup into the recording interface, and I very rarely use an amplifier. Not quite the same with electric guitars. Often the sound of the amplifier is quite a lot of the character of the instrument, but there are quite a few very good amplifier simulators built into the software these days, so you might find that they're absolutely good enough for what you need. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2. One, two, three, two, two. 1, So there's a quick demonstration of how a very humble microphone, the SM57 or another dynamic microphone, can make great recordings. That, by the way, is completely raw. There's no effects, EQ, reverb, nothing. It's just as recorded. And everything was at the same gain on the audio interface throughout as well. So go ahead and try that out. And it might be that you can hear too much of your room, and we'll have a look at dealing with that in the next video.